Welcome to 88 Names Podcast with your hosts Blake Collier and Matt Ruff. On today's episode, we will be talking to Mike Pondsmith, who is a role-playing, board, and video game designer who founded Talsorian Games and is the genius behind the Cyberpunk franchise of role-playing and video games.
D-Rooted is a proud sponsor of the 88 Names Podcast. D-Rooted, immersive experiences and interactive activations helping brands connect globally. Find case studies and more at drooted.com.
For those who may not know who you are, which is probably not a few people, you're pretty well known. Do you mind telling us about who you are and what you do and where that intersects with the realm of VR and AR?
Okay. My name is Mike Pondsmith, and I'm popularly known as the person who killed your Cyberpunk character. Basically, I'm known for the fact that I, many years ago, created a game called Cyberpunk. And it's been since then translated into about 12 languages and eventually ended up being done as a AAA title by my good friends over at CD Projekt RED. And it's available on your newsstands now. So the thing about it is, because of that, when I wrote Cyberpunk originally, I knew it had to be explainable, plus also be acceptable for people who were diving into the genre. The genre was relatively new then. So I did a lot of research to figure out just what a cyberpunk future would look like. You can't do it by looking at just a Blade Runner. Mm-hmm. You have to actually start digging into how the heck do you get there. And as a result, I did a ridiculous amount of research that translated between myself, my staff, friends, and so forth in about 20 odd books detailing a world which is based around a city called Night City. And as a result, one of the things that comes about this kind of research is that you end up, oddly enough, being very good at forecasting what is going to happen in terms of events. You can't help it. If you're reading, 7 or 8 newspapers a day and you're, pulling stuff from Jane's Defense Weekly and Lord knows whatever else, you're going to get a lot of information, and synthesizing it to make a believable world means that you're going to have to actually think and apply it. So as a result, I looked up one day and found I kind of had a reputation of being a unexpected futurist. Nice. So, what the heck? I'm right enough times where people think, I might be right more often than I really am.
Oh, beautiful. So you started Talsorian Games and produced a pen and paper RPG games,
right?
Accessories, and this was all after working in video game graphic design, right?
Right. Yeah, I started off in graphic design. In fact, I had training in both and degrees in both graphic design and psychology, which is kind of amusing. My mother said many years ago that somehow or another I picked the exact right things to become a game designer.
Beautiful.
Not that she thought it was a real job. She used to wonder about, like, when are you going to really get a real job? And when I started working at Microsoft Games, then she finally accepted it. Yeah, that sounded real enough to her. It was Microsoft,
Yeah.
So
this sounds so familiar.
I have all these people over here who work for me, and when you go into Borders, you see our stuff on the walls, and it's still not real. Well, I don't know.
So what led you into going into the pen and paper RPG market, and how has your company changed over the last 35 years?
Oh, boy. I was led into pen and paper because digital gaming at that time, when I was in it, we worked on Apple IIes, which gives you an idea of, the primitive scale we were working on. I think at that time, Richard Garriott and I, Lord British, and I were like 17 and 21 respectively. So we're talking way back. The problem was you couldn't really construct a very solid world that had a lot of immersion because all you had was text. You might as well be doing a novel. And what, imagery you did have, you were cranking out 16-bit stuff. It was pretty primitive. So I ended up backing into tabletop because I ran across, oddly enough, a bunch of Japanese graphic novels about a giant robot series called Gundam. And I went, ooh, this is really great, and I had already been a bit interested in anime. So I did this world called Mechton, and I had to, at that point, figure out why would anybody have giant robots wandering around, huge, 60-foot tall destructive machines. So that meant I had to do some research, and I had to go work out the concepts of the world, because if I were from Gundam, all I had was a bunch of Japanese I didn't understand. And it would be a few years before I made enough friends over in Japan who would say, oh, yeah, that's what was going on, man. You didn't know that? I basically started building worlds from that point, and people were interested in it. And I happened to work at that point as a typesetter. I owned a typesetting shop, basically, for the university. So I had the ability to put this stuff out. So I started doing paper games. And it kept going, and all of a sudden I looked up, and I had a whole lot of people who worked for us, and I'd managed to con my wife into being our business manager, and it just kept going and going and going, and we were pretty good at it. And I didn't really go back to digital until actually about the crash of 2000, when the tabletop game industry just blew up. We actually survived that. We did not go bankrupt. We, stayed in one piece, but it was, almost impossible to maintain a staff. So it was pretty much, once again, my wife and I doing it. And I went back, I had a kid. Basically, I started looking, going, I'm going to have to pay for this kid somehow. So I went back. I was offered a job over at Microsoft, and I went back to digital and worked on a bunch of projects there as well. So that's kind of the arc of my career.
Wonderful.
Exciting, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it isn't. Well, living it wasn't exciting.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
So, in my novel, 88 Names, gaming and game design play a fairly big role. The protagonist, John Chu, is a what I call a Sherpa. He's sort of a paid guide to online role-playing games who will caters adventures for people.
I know you're in trouble because I'm reading your book right now.
And and he's got this dream of founding a company and starting his own MMO. And my personal interest in game design goes back to when I was a kid in New York City. I was a volunteer playtester at SPI, Simulations Publications Incorporated,
okay.
the war games company in Manhattan, long defunct now. But for me, it was like being a kid in a candy store. And of course, war games are a somewhat different beast than RPGs.
Oh, yeah.
In that they're competitive rather than collaborative. And so the playtesting was mostly about game balance and like trying to find those degenerate strategies and root them out that would let one player run away with the game. But I was always fascinated as a 12-year-old, a precocious 12-year-old. It's like, it's like this logic puzzle. Like, here's a rule set, see if you can break it. And and then when MMOs came around, fast forward 20 years, one of the things I loved doing was reading, especially because I didn't have a computer fast enough to actually play them. So I would read game dev blogs where they would talk about some of the headaches they had dealing with emergent degenerate strategies like griefing and player ganking. And, and gold farming, of course, where it's like, we did not design this fantasy world for kids from China to come in and turn it into a money-making enterprise. But it's one thing to try and lay down the law and quite another to get them to stop doing it. And so this just sort of fascinated me on all kinds of levels. And so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your own experience as a designer and where you create a game and you think it's going to be one kind of experience, and then it goes into contact with the real world full of precocious 12-year-olds.
Yeah, right. Oh, one thing, if you were at SPI back then, you probably ran across Eric Goldberg at some point or another.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Eric was one of my mentors, so to speak. Although when we first met, he kind of wandered and said, "Oh, you guys really do have a real company." And I went, "Oh, yeah." Which is Eric. Eric is blunt and to the point. And I also am a really, really big fan of Richard Bartle's writings on MMOs and Muds and Mushes. He was the one who talked about the types of gamer. And from there, actually, that's informed a lot of what I've done, because as I've mentioned to students before when I was teaching, emergent gameplay can be your enemy, or emergent gameplay can be something you can ride and work with. I remember at one point with Halo, people discovered that if you put a grenade underneath a warthog, you could blow it up and you could flip it in the air and do things with it because it was technically indestructible, but it did have collision. So people were putting bombs underneath. How high can I go? And everyone in the team's kind of going, "Oh my God," And I'm thinking, they're engaging with your game. Now, either you're boring them right now, and they have to come up with new games, or they're engaged enough to where they want to use your environment, and you should see where you can use that behavior to your advantage. How can you get them to do something like that, but that doesn't break your game? That may involve looking at how you've designed your terrain and how you're mapping. It may be that some things need to be more destructible or destructible in an interesting way. There's lots of things that fall out of emergent gameplay. So I never looked at it as oh my God, we have to stop this, but rather as, okay, this is telling me what the player is doing with this toy. Okay. And in many ways, what we develop are toys. We're building thought toys, and people find ways to use them. I don't know if either of you have kids, but you go through this with kids. You say, okay, so I got you this, and they're in there playing with the cardboard box you got them.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're going, and actually what's kind of amusing was, for example, my son came up during the beginning of the Pokemon thing. And a lot of the Japanese contacts we had sent him tons of Pokemon. It wasn't even known in the States at that point. And what did that lead to? Well, my son started realizing there were stories behind using a world that had Pokemon. So he wrote at 10 an actually fairly sophisticated RPG about Pokemon. Because of that, he had to sit down and work out the mechanics of it and how you worked out a battle and all that. That's kind of a meta emergent gameplay. He was playing Pokemon, but he said there's something happening beyond the screen. How can I use that? So as I have built worlds in my career, what I've looked at is, what are people going to do with this world? What's going to be interesting? How will they play with it? And one of the things I found out was that people will play with the toys of the world in ways you would never think, but will keep them hooked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm amused at the fact that your character is a game Sherpa. I once actually played in a fairly long campaign a character in a fantasy world who did just that. He wandered around, basically, instead of being part of the party getting gold, my job was basically to lead them to exciting and interesting places where they could go get gold and keep them from getting killed. So when I saw, the basic text of your novel, I kind of went, okay, this guy gets it.
Yeah, I mean, it grew out of, I was just fascinated by this idea of gold farming, that people were doing that, and the dilemma it created for the game companies. And there's that. But the beauty of that yes, it's just so hard to, you can't just, it's like people have this idea, especially in computer games, that the designers have these godlike powers, and they do and they don't, but people are really good at finding ways to get around the rules. And unless you want to break the game or the economy for everyone, it's a really interesting problem, and a really interesting psychological problem from a storytelling perspective. So I just ate that up, and it was fun to write his character.
You picked a really good intersection there. Yeah, what I always found, and I talked about this when I was talking about economies and economics for your game in one of my classes, the idea that you have economies that you have built in your world, and then you have meta economies, and those can encompass things that are outside of the existing frame of the world, but are still driving the world. So you might have like a specific type of armor that people are going to want to get, but they don't want to grind for it. So you've kind of overvalued that armor. But if somebody finds a way to, do the grinding and sell it, you created a meta economy in there where somebody is basically peasant farming to get that armor, so that somebody else can spend real world coin to take that armor. And you'd best think about how that's going to affect your game balance, because they're going to get it. I'm doing that right now. Interestingly enough, Cyberpunk RED which is the new iteration of our original Cyberpunk world, and kind of extends into 2077. It's happening about 25, 30 years before that. And one of the things I did, which I thought was kind of fun, was I developed call it a floating meta economy, a scarcity economy. So you don't go into a store in Cyberpunk RED. You find what are called night markets, which are essentially thrown up impromptu swap meet, farmers market combinations, and you find stuff, and the prices are not locked down. They vary quite widely within a certain general level of expense, but then that level can change depending on other forces outside. So what happens is when you go to buy a gun in RED, you're not sure what it's going to cost. You're not even sure if you can buy a gun that week, because just like in a true scarcity economy, somebody may not have discovered a cache of guns, and that week you're SOL. Or they may have only found 5, 6 guns, and suddenly the price just went right through the ceiling. So I was fascinated by that kind of, kind of almost mirroring the meta economies that you see in an electronic game, particularly one that has a lot of items, and saying, okay, so what would happen if the rules constantly shifted, and the only way you really could beat the rules was to basically know something more about the economy on a larger basis. And what would players do with that? And
Someone
I'm
would
waiting.
just eat that up, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, there would be players out there who, it's like my favorite story. So about economies, my wife and I, well, my whole family, we are all playing. I'm trying to think of the name of it now. Gosh, I can't think. Animal Crossing. That's it. I have so many games in my head, I have to stop thinking about it. So we're all playing Animal Crossing. And, I'm doing my thing, and my son's doing his thing. He likes to fish. I'm in there collecting, fossils, whatever. My wife figured out that you could take things from one instance of the game, and you could transfer them if you got it on to recorded card, and you could transfer what you'd accomplished. So my wife then proceeded to make friends with all of my sons and my friends who were all playing Animal Crossing. And she went out and she got different kinds of fruit from almost every single iteration. And then she dropped back into the core iteration of the game, and she was fruit mistress. She had peaches. Nook didn't even have peaches. Nobody had peaches in that game except Lisa. And she literally cornered the market on exotic foods by looking at the meta economy of that and going, well, this stuff's instancing all over the place. I think I'll exploit that. But she had a great time, because at that point she had to contact all these people and find out, you have cherries over there? Yeah, okay, I tell you what, if you have cherries, I'll bring pears over to you, but I need cherries and I need apples. Okay, deal. And she'd bring apples over and plant apple trees, and they'd all be happy.
So these are different platforms of the game, basically.
Yes.
The game on different platforms, and some of them have stuff that none of the others have, but you can move it. That's fascinating.
Yeah, she figured out early on in playing that, you could get things, and as long as you were moving them, by your cart, essentially, you could take the information and take it over to other iterations, to other people's games. So we had the family core game of Animal Crossing, but she'd go over and at one point she and my son's girlfriend were swapping stuff back and forth, and she was cornering an economy. But what I saw in that was not that she broke the game, although it probably would have driven Nook crazy, were he a sentient being. But what I found was interesting was this is how she had learned to play with the toy. Mm-hmm. And she had found another game built into that. And when you're talking about to kind of spiral back to one of our original conversation points, when you're talking about virtual realities and virtual environments, universes, you have to keep an eye out for that. People are going to find ways to do things that are more than just, I killed the monster. And they need that, because the wider you can spread your net, the more people join your net, the more people are there supporting that environment you've created. And the more people who find things to do in that environment, the more popular your game is going to be, because it hosts an ecology rather than a single play style or a single, type of gameplay. So at any rate.
It's funny, your story about this too, about your wife doing the cross-platform. They kind of anticipated my next question, which I was just sort of curious about.
Sorry.
No problem.
Thank God this is being taped. There we go.
So no, you've kind of anticipated my next question, which is about whether you still learn things at this point in your career from other people's games.
Oh yeah. I have literally within 6 feet of me, I must have about 150 games. And this is nothing compared to what we have in the libraries back home. My son collects games. We get games for Christmas presents regularly. And, oh, wow, we got this. A lot of times it's funny because we'll get the same thing. I'll give it to him. He'll give it to me, or, our wives will pull things out and go, well, yeah, he was talking about this the other day, and you gain a lot from learning what other people are doing. And you really should not be embarrassed to do that. That would be like saying, well, I don't want to sound like I'm copying anybody, so I'm never going to read again.
Yeah.
To get a better writer, you're going to have to read other people's stuff. And you have to be knowledgeable enough to go, okay, I'm just not going to file the serial numbers off this. But on the other hand, this is a good idea. And you also have to kind of accept, if you're successful at it, that people are going to, use some of the same techniques. 30 years ago, I guess it was, I invented a thing called Life Path, which was a way of structuring a character before they actually started playing. They went through a bunch of tables, and those tables basically figured out their background and their love life and, their friends and their enemies and everything. And I did that because at the time, nobody understood what anime was about. So I had to go build something that would structure gameplay in a way where people would build anime characters. They would, have the blue hair. It would make sense. They would have, the giant robot to avenge their father, whatever. And I look up now and, Life Path is standard throughout tabletop now.
Not just there. I mean, I've been.
And then CD. Well, I understood CDPR because immediately when we started talking, he said, we have to do Life Path. And I said, yeah, well, good luck.
No, but I'm even I've been spending a lot of time playing RimWorld, and there too, it's like, you have the previous histories of these characters that you played. I mean, you don't actually do it, but it's embedded in the character creation process. Right. They did this before they became stranded on this alien world. So it's
you build contextual framing for the character. So even if you don't use it very much, you have the story, and thus you can inhabit that character even more. And yet, when I did that, it's like I said, 30, 35 years ago, I had one goal, but I also recognized down the line, people were going to look at this and go, this is really an interesting tool. By contrast, I'm playing a game now. I think it's from Evil Hat, but it's called Scum and Villainy. And it's great because it's a space game. And the way it's framed, the characters and their ship and what they do are already baked in as they begin. They have to, I had one whole session where I just said, okay, you guys go over there and tell me what you're going to do with your ship. Here are the basic rules. Tell me what you want to add to it. What role are you taking? Tell me about your background. And I walked away. I said, okay, what will come of this is these guys will make the game structure they want. I don't have to do it. This is great. And, for you guys out there who wrote Scum and Villainy, I applaud you. That was very, very well done. I'm going to steal it.
That's great. So my own personal introduction to the cyberpunk genre, I think like a lot of people's, was going to see Blade Runner in 1982. And I remember I went to see it in the theater with my cousin Norbert, and we watched the opening credits, and then the card comes up, Los Angeles, November 2019. which at that time was 37 years in the future.
Yeah.
And then there's that opening shot of the LA skyline with the big gas flares and dark sky and these gigantic pyramids. And Norbert leans over to me in the theater and goes, "This is bullshit. It's not going to look that different."
Okay. So I have to pull one thing in on that. I went to see it with my wife. My wife lived in or came from Torrance, which is one of the suburbs of Los Angeles, where they have the enormous fractionating plants and oil factory plants. So we're flying over this, and I go, "This looks just like your mother's place."
Well,
except the cars don't fly. And she's going, "Yeah, you're right. Is this supposed to be the future?" So, sorry about that.
No, but that's totally okay. And it was just Norbert kibitzing, and like Norbert was from Argentina, so it's like I don't think he'd ever been to LA. But the thing was, at the time, I remember thinking at the time, he might be right, but in a way it didn't matter because, of course, it's Ridley Scott isn't necessarily trying to predict the future. He's telling a story. And of course, part of the thing about make-believe is it doesn't have to be, obviously, my thought at the time was that, if he's right, it doesn't necessarily matter because obviously, Ridley Scott is not necessarily trying to predict the future. He's just telling a story, and the way make-believe works, it's like it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be interesting or have something interesting to say. But it is sort of an occupational hazard if you create imaginary futures for a living and you live long enough. Mm-hmm. Eventually, the real world's timeline will catch up with your imagination, and and this is become a meme on Twitter now where, you'll yes. be like, happy incept date, Roy Batty.
Yeah.
So I was just curious for you, what is it like for you now to be able to compare the future as it actually came to pass with the future you imagined in such detail back in, Cyberpunk 2013, Cyberpunk 2020? Does it impact your design philosophy at all or change the way you go about imagining the future, or do you just not care?
Okay. You have to basically understand a basic principle. It kind of guides a lot of Tolstoyan. We do the research. We do a lot of research. It's like when I talk about guns, that's because we've gone out, not just me, but the staff, and we've gone to ranges. Mm-hmm. For example, whenever we go to Vegas ranges and we shoot automatic weapons and we compare notes. We know this stuff because it makes it real. Mm-hmm. So that means that when you do the kind of creation we do of a world, a lot of it is not really blue sky or fantasy. It's extrapolation. You're looking at where you are now and going, how the heck would we get over here? Or what would happen if we did this? Started with this little point. And that is one reason Blade Runner works and why it's my favorite movie, personally. Blade Runner works because they didn't just pull it out of the sky. They extrapolated from what was there. Somebody had to have gone over the hill like I did through the pass, looked down on Torrance and gone, damn, look at all that flame shooting out of things, and what if it was like a big dominant, skyscraper? And somebody said, well, yeah, skyscrapers would be kind of boring. What would occupy the most land?
Pyramids, right?
Yeah. Actually, what I've always loved is the fact that the pyramid, I once worked it out, the pyramid should be covering part of Hawthorne, which was one of the suburbs near there. And it should be covering the entire site of the old Mattel factory, which I really love. Awesome. So at any rate, he got that because they were able to extrapolate a thing that was there. They said, instead of, we have science fiction cities, they're going to go, well, what if the world we were in went to hell? How would things integrate? What would happen to them? What would they evolve to be? Another reason, for example, why I love Blade Runner is that the entire segment where we're in the building, the Bradbury building, and it's where the replicants go in and basically fight Deckard at the end, and where the toy maker lives. It's a real building. It's a real building. I used to go there with my girlfriend at the time, and she and I would just go hang out in the Bradbury building. It was an awesome building. So watching the movie, it's like, well, wait a minute, there used to be potted plants here. Okay. But what I noticed after the third or fourth, no, more like the fifth time I watched the movie, I went, it's really supposed to be the Bradbury building. Okay. So in that moment, I went, I know where this is. And then I started looking around, and, there wasn't Google Maps back then, but I would look around and go, okay, so what would I see? And how did this neighborhood fall apart? This is a fairly high class building. This was expensive legal offices. Why would this neighborhood go to hell? What would be happening in a larger world? So when I see a world that kind of starts seeming like that, the world we've evolved now, a lot of that is not too surprising because it's a natural extension of where we have been or where we might be going. Yeah. As soon as we had 3D printing, I could look at it and go, okay, 3D printing makes sense. They can do that. That means we're going to have prostheses showing up all over the place. And because now, the most important part about that is I do not need a factory to make a thing. I can make an incredibly sophisticated thing, and I can make it for really cheap. And that means, for example, instead of having to go to a specialist to get an arm for my kid who is missing a limb, I can download a file, give it to somebody local that I know if I don't have a 3D printer, and they're relatively cheap. Talsorian, I think we spent like $600 on ours. I can make that arm. My kid has an arm now. I can, flip side, make a weapon. Mm-hmm. Maybe illegal as heck, but I can make a weapon. I can make a tool. I can, build things. So when you extrapolate that, you go, well, you can have an economy where people are banging things out and selling them to other people. That's going to be industrial level, but not backed by industrial capital. Mm. And thus you get Etsy, for example, where, I buy a lot of things off Etsy because, frankly, I can go to somebody and say, hey, I need to get a model of a chip that we're going to be using in one of our Cyberpunk things. Can you go build me this chip? It looks roughly like this. They go and they build it. Wow. So all of those things are outgrowths. If you see a technology pop up and you go, what happens to this in 10 years? What happens to this in 20 years? We sit around and we talk about things, advances in technology and all that, but we don't often ask what's going to drive that. For example, smartphones. Smartphones are driven by the fact that, one, people are going to want to talk to each other anyway. Mm-hmm. And they weren't going to want to have a separate device that they talk to people, they recorded things, they listened to their music. And so it was kind of from the beginning, almost forecasted, eventually you would go from flip phones to smartphones. And I remember when the first smartphones, basically the large format phablets, they called them, people laughed. Everybody in the industry went, oh, yeah, it's so stupid. Who's going to hold something like that up against their face? Yeah. I'm going, well, let's see. I have this phone, and then I have a tablet, and then I have a separate device, and then I have this, and I have a camera, and then, I looked around, I said, if I carried everything I usually carry, I'd look like Batman. Yeah, I'd have a little pack around me, and the bat phone, took that up. So I looked at it and said, they're going to put it all together in one place, and then sooner or later they'll do software. So I came up with this thing called the Agent. And the Agent was basically a proto smartphone where it was basically a phone that had a computer built into it, and it downloaded programs that did things for you. It would remind you to get the laundry or something, My son teases me. He says, you invented the smartphone and you never got paid for it. Who'd have thought, But the point was, I needed, in a world like that, to have people have the ability to get information, transfer information, handle their checking accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that grew out of the need in that world. When that world catches up, the smartphone, basically, my entire life lives in this phone. In fact, actually, it's one of 5. So, I have different smartphones do different things. So sue me. Okay. So, at any rate, I have one that has like a military grade case for when I go out and paleontological digs, and I know I'm going to drop it down 200 foot of cliff. It's like it hits the bottom and it just kind of goes, this something happened.
My dinosaur phone. Wow.
Yeah, that's my dinosaur phone. Yeah. So basically, things evolve because people need them. And one of my favorite William Gibson sayings is, the street finds its uses for things. For a person who doesn't use, from what I gather, technology, Gibson brilliantly understands what technology does.
From business needs to social events, an increasing amount of connection is happening online in immersive virtual spaces. Navigating these unfamiliar platforms and technologies can seem daunting. Locuseum is here to help. Locuseum understands, guides, and informs your project so you can spend time connecting with your community and teams. Unlock more possibilities for connection through virtual events with Locuseum. Visit locuseum.com to learn more.
So you said you did typesetting before you started the company. One of the many reasons why you're such a fascinating figure to me specifically
is you're bored.
No. I am boring. That's no.
I don't think so.
Is that you seem very grounded in reality, and I'm scare quotes that.
Yeah.
And it seems that those grounded technologies still play a role in the publishing of RPG books and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
Is it a world where newer technologies like AR, VR become integrated or collaborative with older technologies like pen and paper RPGs or typesetting?
It's interesting. For RPGs, the big shift came with not my typesetting machine, but literally the Macintosh computer and desktop publishing. I started and I worked on this like $40,000 or $50,000 CompuGraphic machine at the university. I bought. I could never have bought that, and I had the ability to print out type. And since it was part of my job, I went. My boss said, "Hey, mind if I print out my game books?" And I went, "Yeah, whatever." But up to that moment, the only people who could afford to get typesetting were people like TSR, for example, really big companies. And I could suddenly produce a product at the level, at least in terms of typesetting, that they could. Within 3 years, desktop publishing made my entire $40,000 machine obsolete. Wow. Gone. And my mother shows up and she goes, "Yeah, I've got this new thing. It's a Macintosh. You should check it out." And I'm like, well, my mother just showed me this, So I went over, checked it out, and did not take long for me to realize, yeah, this is actually pretty good. Too bad it prints on a dot matrix. But then 6 months later, they started doing what we would consider to be laser printers. Yeah. So I changed jobs. I went to work for a company that did desktop publishing and learned desktop publishing. So within 3 years of starting this, I could now produce a game book that, short of color, looked just like the other guy's books.
Wow.
And that then led to the next jump, which was, within another year, color. Color had been, like the big thing nobody could do. Printing wise expensive as all get out. And remember, my training was in graphic design. So I knew this is really expensive. I was smart because having been trained in it, I knew how to get around and get color when I needed it, but most people didn't. So at that point, getting color was the same way I did, which was separations and plates and all this stuff. It was like laborious. You spent time in the dark room. It was pain. And suddenly there was this jump that went over to digital scanning once they had the technologies of, the technologies of basically digital printing. So within a year, I was able to get a color scanner. I was like, whoa. So instead of having to travel all the way down south to South San Francisco from Berkeley to get something done and spending $800, I can now do it myself. Okay. I'll give you an idea of how scary it was. My art director at the time, who also was an engineer by training, but got bored easy. And he went and redesigned the scanner so that it could match the DPI, the digital print stuff of the highest end scanners in existence. The people who made the original scanner were so shocked they tried to hire him, because he came back and said, yeah, I did this. You guys might want to do this, this, and this. And they're like, but I looked at it and said, yeah, well, Matt wanted a higher level scanner, and I'm lucky he just didn't rebuild our computers at the same time. What I'm saying is all these things are incremental because people find uses for them.
Yeah. So
in the same way as games have mods, technology gets mods, and it gets them really fast because people go, hey, I got this new thing and I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but wait, I could do this with it, or I needed to do this. Who can do it for me?
Do you ever miss the hands-on quality of the old typesetting machine?
Nope.
No.
It's a real pain in the butt.
Yeah.
You have to work with hot wax to glue it down. You have to use chemicals that probably were, luckily my son was not born with strange, warts on his head or something.
Yeah.
Because I used horrifyingly weird chemicals to process this stuff. And before that, when I was in high school, I was taught on a linotype machine, which used slugs of lead.
Oh, wow.
So it you had hot lead in the back of the journalism class. And I'm thinking, hot lead in the middle of a school building. Okay, we must have been crazy. And our teachers must have been crazy, But I guess the point is somebody decided hot lead was too dangerous. So they moved up to photographic, which meant somebody looked at photographic plates and said, I wonder if I could build large format photographic paper. I already have that. And if I put it on a roll and figured out a way to dip that paper in developers, then I could photograph really big stuff. And then I could figure out how to use a laser to write the things I needed. And then somebody else said, well, what if I could get away with doing that? But I did it with little dots and dust, and I used the same programming. And everybody took one piece like a relay and went forward.
Yeah.
And that's driven by the fact that people need it and they want to mod it to get what they want. One of the problems we have right now, we're talking about VR, is that we haven't really yet found a place where people really need it. We're using Zoom right now and, zipping around, and everybody's using something like this. But, my sister used to work in tech support for a very large corporation, and she was in charge of face-to-face video conferencing. And she said, I get maybe 2 people a year to do that. The rest of my job is everything else, but nobody does video conferencing. We didn't need video conferencing. Now, I needed video conferencing, so I was using Zoom before people really had to use Zoom, before we had the pandemic.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, oh yeah, so everybody's catching up, right? Just making my Zoom issues much harder. But the point was, nobody needed it till now. We will never go back to non-using it.
Yep.
Because it's too useful now. So this will be the way we do certain things, and it'll beat the heck out of getting on a plane and flying somewhere. I mean, when I worked with CDPR, I flew to Poland a fair amount, but I wasn't going to spend 9 hours in the air all the time. So I could do that maybe twice, 3 times a year, maybe. But, there's a big difference between that and my shambling in my pajamas and talking to a bunch of guys who are 9 hours ahead of me, and they're in a conference room getting ready to go home, and I'm in my pajamas just getting up with a cup of coffee, and we go, okay, so what do we want to do with Johnny in this scene? And I'm realizing, this is a totally different way for us to do projects, totally different way to do stuff. We haven't yet stumbled on that in terms of, actual VR worlds.
Yeah.
And what we have are like half steps. But I see signs of it. For example, I remember that when we first started building, let's say, Matrix Online, people were messing around with the emotes and things like that. They wanted to wander into buildings. They wanted to do stuff. I used to go up to the top of the tallest building in the Matrix universe and just stand there and kind of look over the city, But people like to do that. And eventually in City of Heroes, which was a really popular MMO back then, in the day, they started giving award badges for people going to places in the city. They did not win or fight fights or uncover anything. They could say, I went to this place. Ever seen the view over here? Ever seen the sunset go down over here? Whatever. And they're doing that now in 2077. Half of 2077 isn't the missions. It's, I made these friends, or I did this thing, or I saw this. Here, let me show you all my pictures. They're not using it just in terms of missions. They're using it as a place to live, which is one of the things I love about, the Iteration Night City, is that it's a place where people could live. They can, with a higher level of depth, they might be able to hit the various local sake joints or whatever. And, I'm always fascinated by what people do in that environment, because it's just a few inches away from something that isn't a video game, but is just a straight on environment where you can just go live there. And then once you have that level of detail, that's when you start talking about VR, because you want that immersion factor. But, right now, I remember the first time I wandered through V's apartment, and I was going, yeah, this is kind of a real Blade Runner-like place. I always wanted a place like this, and I'm walking over the window and I'm looking at the city going by and all that, and I'm just going, damn, yeah, okay. You gonna do anything? No, I think I'll just hang around here. Yeah. Wait, Delavan's sending you messages. Screw him. He's an AI. He doesn't matter. So you basically, that is immersion. That is, I think I'll go down to the streets of Watson and wander around and see what's happening.
Awesome.
I haven't been to Pacifica, and I know that someone's going to try to shoot me while I'm there, but I'm going to go to the beach. Well, if you could go to the beach and know that things happened, environments went on, and there were little stories, and it was like one person you got to know there, you go to the beach a lot, and then eventually you'd want to just put the headset on and go, "Hey, Pan Am, I'm on the beach. Hey, let's go swimming." We just haven't gotten the need yet, and that, I think, is because we don't have the environment yet. And I've nattered on now for almost half an hour.
Well, no, yeah, it's interesting though, because it's funny. I come at this at a very different angle, where I was going to ask about what you thought about the current state of VR and AR technology, and whether what it can do is sufficiently advanced to do the kinds of things you want to do. And it sounds like you're approaching this from the other aspect of, like, when I've got something I want to do that requires VR will work, and not before. Whereas I tend to think of what can the technology do, and then what can I do with it as it currently exists. And
it fills a need. Yeah.
But see, I think that's the difference, is what we're doing right now. My sister had back, in the 90s at her job, which is face-to-face cameras, communication. There was no need. There was no need. Two reasons. One, pandemic, true. But another is, we didn't have businesses that stretched around the globe. In a given day, I could be talking to someone in Tokyo, in Poland, in Venezuela. Sometimes my Zoom list looks ridiculous. And the reason for that is business had changed. You now did projects with people everywhere, and they crossed time zones. And it cost too much money to fly there, and you couldn't get as much done by the time you flew there, and you got into the hotel and you got something to eat, and people came pick you up. My days at CDPR were usually spent just from, I get in there maybe 9 and it'd be, all the way till, whenever. And usually we went into the night just hanging out. And I still couldn't get as much done as I would on a daily, hey guys, 9:00, Pacific time. Oh yeah, that's right. 5:00 your time. Won't be on a lot. There was a need.
Yeah.
And so at that point, even though the tool had existed for a long time, we now used it and we had a reason. We've had 3D printing for at least 10 or 20 years now. We haven't had a need to use it until, to be honest, people started figuring out, gee, I'd like to have a figure of my D&D character, or I'd like this little statue or whatever. And then that suddenly, I was amazed. The price on a 3D printer went from, insanely expensive to $500, $300, and you look at Etsy now and there's a billion people out there selling things that are 3D printed. Yeah. The need became there. And so, I'm a great believer that need drives the use of an invention. The street has to find a way to use it.
Use for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the problem with VR is that, okay, years ago when I was working on Dream Park, I remember going to, think his name, Jared Lanier, one of the first VR guys. I cannot think of his name.
Sounds like Jared. Yeah.
Yeah, Jared, right. And tall guy, lots of long dreadlocks.
Yeah, that's Jared.
Yeah. Okay. So I went to, his shop. He's in Marin at the time. And, I'm looking at, I'm doing the VR thing, and reaching out and, it's still relatively primitive. And I remember walking out of there going, this is really cool. And I cannot think of a single way in which I will utilize this. It was like, this is insanely cool. And I can't think of how I'm going to use it. And now if, I was thinking about it, I go, well, I might be able to do, because the technology is up there, I could do microsurgery with that because now there's robotics that I'd like to be able to control on the other side of the planet to do this surgery. And I need this telepresence to be able to get into the gloves, so to speak. I could look at it as I have a self-driving car, but I could use telepresence to get into that vehicle and control it from a distance. I could use this to not just talk to the lander on Mars, but I could now be present with the right cameras and arrays and some things that cut the lag time down. I could be walking around on Mars and feel, more than just what I sort of see through a camera right now, because I'd be able to say, oh, I need to look over there. Oh, look, there's a rock down that's actually, interesting. So we haven't developed, my personal opinion at least, we haven't developed the needs yet to use some very, very sophisticated technology. We have to find the way for the street to use it.
It's really interesting because we just did an interview with a woman who works with NASA and is using VR, and she's talking about some of these applications very similar to what you just discussed. So that's really interesting. So she's looking for uses for it.
Yeah. And what will happen is that eventually uses will develop around her that she'll see, like, if I could do this, I could do this over here.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, she's going to walk out and look at the toolboxes that are scattered around and go, okay. It's like 3D printing and prostheses. This is something I'm really big on, and one of the things I see is that when it was a specialist thing, then, there were kids who were going around who didn't have anything in terms of a hand or whatever. But I remember being just blown away by the fact that at one point, one of the developers on a 3D project built an Iron Man arm for this little kid. And he got Robert Downey Jr. to deliver the Iron Man arm. That's awesome. And I went, my God, you know how much that, probably cost? And I stopped and I thought, I said, Not much at all. Come to think of it. I mean, I don't have the skills to manipulate 3D, but I know 24 people who could do that. So this kid is going to go from, that's Bobby who has no arm and we give him shit, to Bobby's got the really cool Iron Man arm.
That's awesome.
Bobby's life has just changed.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, as I'm seeing now, Bobby's arm will develop into eventually he's Johnny Silverhand. Well, not a psychopath who's Johnny, but
Yeah. So I'm kind of the skeptic, the technology skeptic of the podcast. So I always like to ask the question that I'm about to ask you. What parts of AR, VR technology do you think have a potential for negative outcomes or are problematic from your perspective? And do you see ways to reverse those trends?
Well, that kind of goes with anything, any technology.
Mm-hmm.
Well, ask yourself what you get when you're able to be in a place that you're not really in. I see an amazing form of porn, but it's kind of in that level of, is that bad? I don't know. Kind of depends on your porn. but you have the question of, well, certain kinds of weapons and things are going to become much easier to use. I see actually in that particular case, there's a really weird one, which is right now, if you want to get into a firefight with somebody, there's a pretty good chance you could end up with holes through yourself as the other guy. But if you could control weapons from a droid or some of the robot, Spot from Boston Dynamics has got a gun for you, and you could go to light gunning people down.
Yeah,
you're not in any risk. Where a soldier going over the top, so to speak, they've got that flesh in the game. So I think it's going to manage to give some people the ability to dehumanize other people, either from the porn direction or from the combat directions.
Yeah.
There are a lot of situations where I think we're going to discover that dropping people into a totally realistic virtual environment is not going to be good for them. You can be in an environment where you're 300 feet down with the drone and side by side with it and realize that you have a terror of deep water, and that's going to be bad.
Yeah.
And someone's going to be ripping the headset off you as you think you're drowning. So we're going to go into places that I think we never thought of, which, when you get down to it, we face the same thing with like social media.
Yeah.
Social media was considered to be, it's going to be really great. And then we kind of realized, yes. And we're also going to have trolls.
No.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so, it comes with, something else that may go with it. And a lot of times you don't know what that's going to be,
So is
I had been on the internet for a long time, back during Usenet and things like that. So I was kind of used to the idea of trolls. So, and people messing with other people. But even, with that experience, I had no idea what the heck was going to eventually evolve.
Yeah.
I never would have seen it as being a tool, for example, for, literally international warfare. And yet, as we've seen between election cycles here and abroad, between, various groups supporting or unsupporting or fighting with each other, it's suddenly become more than just, hey, I like Star Trek. No, that Star Trek that you like sucks. No, it's different. No one could have seen that.
So is reversing those trends, would that ultimately always going to be reactionary? As they come, like as a new conflict comes forth, are we just doomed to always be like reactionary in how we approach these things, or is there a psychological element to like basically putting elements into a game or into a virtual reality world that negates or at least softens some of those elements?
You can guess, but if you have to think about it, then somebody else out there has probably already thought about it.
Makes sense.
And they're already figuring out what they can do. So it's going to be reactive from the moment the thing exists. Remember, I said the street finds its uses.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Gibson. Basically, what I'm saying by that is every time you come up with something, there's people out there who are going to think negative or positive ways of using it.
Yep.
And they're going to continue to do that because human beings are very experimental. And at some point, someone's going to say, yeah, let's do snuff videos where, you get to snuff people and be there. And the rest of us are going to be going, dude, what's wrong with you? And he's going to go, well, there's somebody out there who like it besides me, and he'll be selling it, So you are, by the very nature of invention, going to always be reactive.
Yeah.
I think what you have to think of, interestingly enough, is how you're going to deal with classes of things. How you're going to deal with, it's kind of like you could look at a car and go, there are 100 things that you could do well with a car and bad with a car.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we should be looking at vehicles as a class of situations and go, okay, so we have really fast things that move faster than horses. But on the other hand, people race horses and they fall off and get killed. So maybe we need to think about how we're going to control illegal street racing, or at least know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Instead of going, wow, I was shocked, man. They got out there and they were like 300 miles an hour in that Porsche. Dude, if they were doing it in, a racehorse, 70 years ago, steeplechasing around Ireland, they're going to do the equivalent here, because there's always going to be some guy who goes, yeah, let's go out and race. We're going to do it. So I almost think sometimes you have to think about classes of things.
Mm-hmm.
And think about, okay, this can mess with people's minds. What do we want to do with that? What do we want to do to watch out for things? It's a little like what Bill Gates has said about pandemics. Bill Gates has been saying for years, we're going to have a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't know what that pandemic's going to be. But what you can do is you can start thinking about, okay, how will we, when we have that pandemic, kick things into gear for distribution? How are we going to get faster at working at cures? Are we going to have special labs to jump on that? Are we going to continue to work on the private sector? How are we going to get around governments that may not want to do this? Some guy over there is going, well, my people haven't gotten this yet, but the guy over the hill that I hate, they're going to get it, throwing blankets with plague on them over
there you go.
borderline, So, what Gates is looking at realistically is, I can't stop every pandemic necessarily, but I can put together ways to deal with pandemics so that when something shows up on that screen, I go, okay, well, we got a pandemic. You guys go over here. You guys, we drilled this. We should all know this. Good.
Yep.
And particularly communication media is going to be a big thing. We have access to more knowledge than anybody has ever had in human history.
Yeah.
We have access to more capabilities than anybody has had. The other day I was sitting here eating something with my wife, I was going, you realize that, the gods of Olympus could not be eating avocados. And you and I just went down to the store and got a bunch of avocados and made guacamole, And I went, the idea of being able to move vast amounts of food or supplies the way we do, it's our background now. But, if you jumped back 20 years, you'd go, whoa, that's going to change things, For example, we have a big problem with really horrible jobs and things being shipped offshore, and thus jobs go away. But that's possible because we have container ships, which means you can have some guy in a horrible swamp in Vietnam raising shrimp and wrecking that swamp so that he could put those frozen shrimp on board a container ship so I can get them in 2 weeks at my local store.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that before. Nobody could do that before. And nobody would have thought of doing it before. So you stop and you go, when you have access to very, very fast, large transport of material, what effects will come out of that?
Mhm.
For example, in Red, half of the Cyberpunk Red universe uses containers.
Mm.
They have stuff in them, but their offices and their homes and their temporary bases. The nomad culture that I created is pretty much container based. And, that obviously couldn't come before, but I was looking at that way the hell back at Mechton going, well, I have a giant robot and I have two giant robots. They can pick up a container and walk it over someplace, and that meant I just moved my military base somewhere else, So, yeah, I don't think you can not be reactive, but I think you can be reactive in a smart way and get ahead of the curve by looking at the specific things, kind of the categories of what might get weird. And also, when new things come up, because you start to prepare that, you can go, okay, what does this mean to me? The long lamented by nobody V3 Cyberpunk I did back in 2000. Most people miss the whole point of Cyberpunk V3. They look at it as, it's about transhumanism. The main point of V3 was about social connectivity. It was about the fact that after the world had gotten totally messed up in the last war, we still had the ability to communicate to each other over huge distances. And so we could build communities. And that the multiple alt cults, as I called them then, were effectively communities that were based in a non-contiguous fashion. I can be a member of QAnon here or in Scandinavia, but we're still in communication and we're still hooked up with QAnon. So what I was talking about then was what happens when those cultures can get started and everybody's claiming to have the truth. Everybody's claiming to have the way. And that was the main point of V3. I've thought about rewriting it one of these days, so it's kind of a little separate from Cyberpunk, to make that point of this is what happens when you have what I called in the game culture conf, cultural wars that were about more than, marches, whatever, but communicating over those distances, being able to transfer the information of whatever your cult believed and transfer it instantaneously to an insanely large audience. So, we have to think about this in the sense of classes of things, I think, rather than, individual technologies.
That's good.
How long have I been ranting? Okay.
No, you're good.
This has been this is really
my wife
interesting.
has been my wife has been on my case. She says, shut up and go write the book.
It'd be good. I would buy it. I'd read it.
I'll buy his book, and actually I already bought your book, so it's now going to be you have to buy mine when I write it.
I will do so. Well, I just bought Cyberpunk 2077, and that one of the nice things about doing this interview is it gave me a good excuse not to wait for a sale price. I tend to with triple. I'm cheap, so with AAA games, I will often wait till the first Steam sale, and I was like, nah, now I don't have to.
Yeah.
So.
I have a different problem, which is that because I'm license holder or whatever the hell, basically they send us copies and copies and copies, and I think I have about 40 copies of the game in different formats now, just in boxes. You say, "Yeah, Mike, we're sending you some more." So about once a week or so, some enormous box shows up from Poland, and it's covered in CDPR, We Are Rebels tape, and we look at it and go, what do you think's in there? I don't know. Anybody we know?
So this, I guess, sort of lead to our wrap-up question. What's next for you now? Because obviously Cyberpunk 2077 just dropped 2 months ago. I'm sure you've got plenty of work left to do on that in terms of DLC and tie-ins and future expansions and stuff. And So are you already looking ahead to projects beyond that? Or do you have a dream project that you like to do, whether or not it's actually in the works yet?
We have a bunch of them, but most of them are at Talsoria now. 77, we got to the end of all that at our side and we went, okay. And, we have bugs to fix, but they're not our bugs, My job is mainly to shape and say, hey, we want to go here. What do you guys think? So I'm partially, my job is a vision holder. But although I have lived through in my career bug fixing and everything else like that, so believe me, they have a great deal of sympathy. Basically, I now concentrate on Talsorian because Red and all the things connected with it are selling insanely well. And we're running as fast as we can to keep up. This has been the most successful product in our history. And, as Lisa likes to say, I just had another distributor come up and, call me and say, oh God, I underordered again. I never saw this before. So, we have a lot to do there. I have some interesting sub projects I'm going to do. Some of them are because I'm doing a lot of history study right now. Some of them are actually going to be more historical, as in like Castle Falkenstein, which was a, kind of what if history. But right now, oddly enough, I'm trying to stay ahead of what we have done because that's a lot of work. And I am working on getting my degree in paleontology of all things.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I dabbled in it and I've been on digs and found stuff and had a great time. And I discovered I like walking around in, as Lisa calls, gravel pits looking for dead things. And I said, okay, so I get to look for dead things. I get to wander around. It's quiet. And I go back and I drink ridiculous amounts of beer with other geologists. I'm there.
Perfection.
Well,
That's awesome.
Yeah, I've been spending the last year or so until the pandemic hit, working in a preparation lab at the Burke Museum in Seattle. And it is one of the things I love doing. The pandemic broke my heart because, it's one of those things you're sitting there and you're going with your tools and a whole bit like that. And, the rattling and all the other stuff and the horrifying chemicals we use. And you're going, I'm unearthing a T-Rex.
Yep.
Son of a gun. You're thinking, as 10-year-old me would have been like, screaming in joy. And, instead I'm kind of going, oh man, this sucker's really hard to get out of this rock. But, then light goes on, you go, yeah, but you're unearthing a T-Rex.
Yep.
Nobody, half the people in the world would never be able to say that. They would not be sitting in a bar and say, how was your day today? Oh, well, I was digging out a T-Rex pelvis. Really?
That's hilarious.
So yeah, that's mainly what I'm doing this next year. I'm taking geology classes now by remote and discovering just how much I don't know. And it's kind of fun because I kind of know how to do what I do. I've had practice. So, it's nice learning a whole new thing.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for donating your time. It's just been really nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
GC Records proudly sponsors this podcast. To stream or download over 20 years of music, head to gcrecords.bandcamp.com.
That is it for this episode of 88 Names Podcast. If you like the podcast, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a rating and a review, which will help us get more listeners. Remember to check back at the podcast site at riseupdaily.com/88namespodcast for the podcast introduction and upcoming written interviews and articles.